Okay. So welcome everybody. Today's meeting is going to be over story writing for video games. Is it not? So first up, we're just going to go over some quick announcements. We're going to post announcements about this week. This upcoming Friday, so this Friday, we have a social night. So we have our monthly social night. It's unfortunately the last social night actually of the semester. And that's only because we have our game jam on the following second Friday of the month. So this is your second and last chance to have a social night this semester. But the good news is we're gonna have a fun time. For those of you who don't know what a social night is, we just kind of get together over in Marston. We play a bunch of board games and video games and stuff like that, and just kind of hang out. You can come at whatever time you want, as long as it's after 7. And again, we'll get some more announcements out about that. It's in Marston 2200, but we'll have an announcement so you don't have to memorize that or anything. If you were there last month, then it's in the exact same location at the exact same times and everything. All right. So we're going to get started with Kahoot as a warm-up. All right, here we go.
I mean, I know what I want to put.
All right. So story is not necessary to make a game good. That is because you can have games without a story, right? A lot of people play first-person shooters that are like online, for example. People enjoy those, and a lot of those don't have a story with that. Also you can say something like Mario, for example. It has a story, but it's very simplistic. A lot of people aren't playing Mario for the storyline, they're playing it for the gameplay. And that's just kind of the reasoning behind that answer. Moving on to the next one. This one's a little bit trickier. All right, I tricked a couple people with the first one. So basically, every good story typically has a character, settings, plot, conflict resolution. We'll go in more in depth on all those topics in a bit. A story doesn't necessarily have to have heroes and villains. It just has to have some sort of conflict, right? It can be just about one character going through some sort of turmoil in their lives, and that can make a good story. There doesn't have to be necessarily a villainous character in the story in order to make it a good story. All right. All right, good. Survival horror, that was a little bit of a tricky one. That one is known for a lot of storytelling and stuff like that, but it's not as well known as role-playing games. And the only reason I would argue that is because role-playing games often have hundreds of hours worth of storyline, whereas a survival horror game will only usually be, let's say, at most like 50 to 80 hours, somewhere in there. So that's why. I know some survival horror games don't even have a story. It's a very simplistic setup. For example, the Slenderman game, that usually you're just kind of dropped into that game. There is, I guess, some lore and some story to that, but for the most part, you're just kind of dropped in, you go run around. Whereas something like a role-playing game, like there is always usually a very in-depth story along with it. All right, more Kahoot. So this one you can pick, there's 2 answers for this one, so pick 2. Sorry if the player limit got reached. I wasn't able to set it past 20. Right, so exposition and visual storytelling were the correct answers. Audio storytelling, while that can be done, it's not generally a way to tell a story in games. And when I mean audio storyline, I don't mean like exposition and talking and stuff like that. I mean telling a story through like music, sound effects, stuff like that, and not necessarily visuals. So keep that in mind. There's going to be a cool question on that a little bit later. And then written isn't necessarily a storyline kind of way to tell a story. It's just kind of a genre kind of example. So like a book would be a written story. A video game is more of a digital story. Even if it's a, that's what I'm looking for, kind of graphic novel to style game. All right, good. You can have talking outside of cutscenes. Nice, everyone got that one right. We'll talk about that more later, but you can have visual storytelling. All right. All right. So this was a bit of a trick question. So I was kind of talking about this a little bit earlier. Audio is usually meant to enhance the story. Again, there can be situations where you can tell a story entirely through audio, but usually when I talk about audio, I talk about music, sound effects, stuff like that. So that's meant to enhance a story experience, enhance the emotions that you're getting out of a story, and not necessarily tell that story. And then even with audio, usually you have like written, either if there's like a dub along the bottom, some sort of like text along the bottom, or if your game's entirely spoken through some sort of text system. Usually audio is just kind of meant to kind of enhance that. You have a character voicing over it, and you always have text for those who can't hear to kind of go along with it. So it's usually meant to enhance the story, but it can be used to tell a story as well, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so now we're going to go into the slides, and now I'm going to explain all this stuff that we just kind of went over. So you weren't expected to get all of those right. If you did, good job. But we're going to now talk about why the heck I chose those and what the heck I meant by all those questions. Okay, so there's two main ways that video games tell a story. And the first one is pretty obvious, that's through exposition. So exposition is usually done in cutscenes. Not only in cutscenes, but it's done normally in cutscenes. It's usually done through either text or narration. Usually the narration is accompanied by some text. Again, that's for those who either have the game muted or just simply cannot hear. And that's typically how the majority of games are done, unless you're making a completely auditory experience. And those are a little bit more niche. Most games will usually have options for both. Then we also have visual storytelling. That's another big one. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but it's usually meant by, you'll walk into, let's say, a massive environment, and you'll be able to look around and say, okay, I know what kind of happened here. I can kind of pick up on context clues within the world, and I don't need somebody to walk in the room and say, hey, there was a battle fought here. I can see the aftermath of a battle that was fought. And then also character and enemy design. You can look at a character, and then you might be able to glean something about the character off of their appearance, off of what they're wearing, maybe even off the way they kind of act and stuff like that as well. So for cutscenes, so there's pros and cons of using cutscenes. The pros are mainly that it gives the player a break from the gameplay, it rewards the player at the end of the challenge, and it can show the scene from a different angles and prevent the player from interrupting that kind of thing. And usually a lot of cutscenes that people think about are what are called pre-rendered cutscenes. So somebody will do it in a like an animation software, like let's say Blender, for example. It won't be done in the game engine. Now they can be done in the game engine, but the pre-rendered cutscenes, the purpose of those is to, first of all, it can make the game look a lot prettier. They're not as common anymore because game engines can look really pretty without having to do the rendering ahead of time. But if you really want to glean something out of The visuals, you can always try to use a pre-rendered cutscene instead. Then, of course, there's in-game cutscenes. So that's usually where, while the players are like walking up to each other, the camera can still move around and stuff, but the visuals don't change at all. There's usually not too crazy of a drastic like scene change. It's usually just two players walk up to each other, they start having a conversation, and it's a lot more, how do I put it, in the context of the game. It's not taking you out of the experience. There's no black bars that like appear around the edges of the screen or anything. It's just kind of seamlessly transitioning into the game. So those are a lot better. But either way, they both have cons where it takes the player out of the experience because all of a sudden I'm playing a game, I'm pressing buttons, I'm interacting with the world, and all of a sudden I can't do anything. The character's just talking. It's like watching a movie. And then it can be just kind of clunky that way. So there are pros and cons to cutscenes, but if you can get away with maybe having a character interaction while you're walking around the world, you don't have to physically stop everything to do it, that'll stop getting the player unimmersed. And we'll talk about immersion a little bit later too. But immersion is the key point of storytelling in a game. You want to keep the player immersed, and a game world is really great at doing that as long as you do it right. So exposition. So the easiest way to give information to the player is just to tell them things. It can be conveyed through a variety of different ways. So you can have, obviously, character dialogue, that's an obvious one, or you have voiceover narration. A really interesting one that I'm going to post later on in the chat is a game called Hyper Light Drifter. So in Hyper Light Drifter, there's a story, but it's entirely told through images. The only text is during the tutorial of the game. The rest of the game, there is no text whatsoever. Even if you're in shops and purchasing stuff, it's all done through like symbols and images. It's a really cool way of doing exposition. And then keep it short. Don't throw a wall of text up at your players all the time. At least if you're going to do that, like break it down into smaller chunks and then feed it to them through like maybe a character conversation or something like that. That's usually a better way of handling that. And then last up is visual storytelling. So environmental storytelling is huge. It's a massive way that storytelling is done these days, mainly because you can get a lot of visual detail into a lot of your games and projects, just because of the technology that we're working with these days, right? So back in the old days, if they had pixel art graphics, you could put a lot of detail on things, and that would kind of cause things to players to have to make a lot more assumptions, and the worlds will have to be a lot smaller and more compressed. But now you can make a really crazy looking, beautiful looking castle. You can show little nicks to the walls where arrows maybe bounced off of things, or people were slashing swords, and you can say, hey, there was a battle fought here. I can see the evidence of a battle. I can see arrows stuck in the ground still and stuff like that. And that's more of an impact than somebody walking up to you and saying, hey, some guy swung a sword at me earlier today. And, you know, it's usually just a lot more immersive. And then, yeah, use the art and the geography. If it's a watery kind of world, then you can know that maybe the story has something to do with like the ocean or something like that. And then design your characters to reflect the storyline. If you have a character that maybe has gone through a traumatic experience, maybe they might dress or act in a way that's similar to that. Maybe they're a very happy, bubbly character because they had something very good happen to them in the storyline, something like that. Those are really big things to kind of think of. Usually when people think of visual storytelling, they think of the world and they don't think of the characters as much, but the characters are a huge part of the storyline, as we'll talk about, and their designs and the way they look and the way they act should reflect that. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to go into character design today because that's like a whole topic in and of itself, but it is something you should definitely consider when making a story for your game. So now we're going to move into more Kahoot questions. All right, here we go. I'm going to be shocked if more than half of people get this question. This is a tough one. Nice, nice. Not quite half, but still a lot more than I was expecting. Okay. Nice. That was a good one. I'm not even going to explain that one. You guys got that. Do you have any English majors here? Do you have any writing majors? No? Doubly impressed. So you can select none of them, you can select all of them. Already covered one of these already, a little bit. All right. So we already talked about looks and designs. That's usually a huge part of the character. The personality of the character, also very important. How they have kind of lived their lives before you meet them might greatly influence the personality that they have. Their likes and dislikes is a really good way to think about how the player would, or the character would react in the world and to the player's actions. And then their habits and speech pattern is also really important. Maybe if a character has an accent, then that might mean that they are from a different part of the world. It doesn't have to even be a realistic accent that we know about today, but maybe even an accent that is exclusive to your world. Maybe they speak in a weird way that means they came from a different continent in your game world or something like that. All right, and we're going to do one more. All right. So lore doesn't have to be included, but it does help, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, back to the slides. Okay, so there's 3 pillars of video game writing. Those are the plot, the characters, and the lore. And the most important part to do when you're thinking about video game writing is choose one that you're going to really hyper focus on, and then you can kind of pick and choose the other 2 around that one and build off of that one pillar that you're using as your foundation. Same way when you're building a building, you make sure that you have these pillars to kind of support everything else. Picking one of these pillars is going to be huge to helping support your storyline of your game. And now we're going to talk about, yes?
Why would you only pick one if there's 3 pillars?
So one of these is going to be the foundation. One of these is going to be holding up your house, right? That's a good question. And then the other pillars, you don't have to, your house is small enough that you can only choose one if you want. You can still choose the other pillars, but they're not going to be the central pillar that upholds the entire building, right? Maybe they can hold up just the dining room or just the kitchen or something like that. But one of these is going to be the pillar that supports the entire building. You can kind of think of it that way. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. The problem is if you pick a bunch of these to kind of try to build around at once, you're going to be like, okay, so I've got this plot. I need to start writing this plot, but I also got to think about the characters, and I got to think about what kind of lore elements I want to include, and it kind of gets a little bit mixed around. So you should pick one first. You should flesh that out entirely and say, these are non-negotiable. I want this character to be this way, dress this way, look this way, act this way. And then you can start writing your story. And now that you've already chosen that character as your main solid point that you're starting with, choosing the other stuff will come a little bit easier to that. Okay, so plot. So the plot is kind of similar to writing it just for like a novel or a movie. A lot of you have probably seen this in a creative writing class if you've ever taken one before. So you just have to think of what happens, what's the overall idea of your story. You have to think about where it happens, right? That can be where in the world does it happen, where in time does it happen. You should think about when does it happen, right? Again, with the time thing. It couldn't be in an alternate universe to maybe a different game, especially if you're making like a fan project of another game, or maybe an alternate universe to one of the games you've already written. And then how does it happen? How does it start? And then more importantly, also how does it end? And then pitch your plot around, right? Write a plot out, write a plot to a story, and then go up to your friends and say, hey, how does this sound? Is this, exciting? Is this interesting? Do you like the characters? Do you like the different things that happen? Is this a good twist on the story? And then kind of try to work their feedback in. So here's something that I'm going to suggest to everybody, and that's just to not write your resolution off the bat. You don't even have to not write it. Just make it something that you're not 100%, set in stone. And that's only because you'll be making a game, you'll be working on it for a while, and you go, oh, I don't think I'm going to have time to add this part, or this character's going to be really hard to add into the game or write for, or I don't have the artistic ability to maybe represent this thing. And for the majority of games, the ending usually does change, unfortunately. It doesn't always change completely, but it does change in some slight way. So it really is going to hurt you if you sit down and you write out the entire plot and you go, okay, and it's going to end this exact way. All of this stuff has to happen, and then it has to end this exact way, because things are going to change in your storyline. So you can write a resolution when you're writing out the plot, but don't put a pin in that and say this has to be how it ends, because that's going to hurt you in the end. And trust me, if you've ever worked on a game before, you've probably run into this issue at least once in terms of writing stories for games. All right, so writing characters. So writing characters is really fun. It's also really hard to do. Make sure that you think about the looks and designs of the characters. Make sure you think about the personality, likes and dislikes, backstory, habits, and speech patterns. You don't always have to put a backstory in. That always helps. It gives the player a reason to know why the character acts the way they do, the way they dress the way they do, so on and so forth. And then another good way to kind of create a character is to think about how would they react in different situations. I know when we did this talk last year, somebody suggested doing something called AI Dungeon, if anybody's heard of that before. An AI dungeon is just kind of like an AI that you can kind of do like Dungeons and Dragons through. But it reacts based off whatever you type in. So you can type in any scenario and it'll try to make up a story off of that scenario. So you can play as one of your characters. It's kind of like a fun activity to do. And you can play through AI Dungeon and you can say, okay, in this situation, the character would react like this. In this situation, the character would react like this. And it helps you to kind of think about how the character is going to react in your storyline. And that makes it easier to write for the character, because when you're writing moment-to-moment dialogue, it's a lot different than writing an overall story of how a character works. And then how do your characters interact with each other? So that's another like really complicated, messy thing. It's like, all right, I've got this character, he's really funny and he likes to laugh a lot, and I've got this character who's really edgy and dark and doesn't like to talk, and now they're going to have a conversation with each other, and you're like, how is that going to play out? And then the player is going to talk in that conversation as well, or have like dialogue options. I need to know how both of them are going to react to both what the player is saying and then what each other are saying. And that's going to get really messy and really convoluted. So if you know each of the characters individually, you should be able to figure out what they say. If you really want to, and you have a friend maybe who's working on the project with you, you can have them role play as one of the characters. But they have to also really understand, again, the backstory of the character, the personality, and what they would say in every situation. But that can kind of help you flesh out the characters, because dialogue writing, if none of you have done it before, it's really hard to do. Especially moment to moment in a short dialogue, trying to get a conversation to happen really quickly in a story and not drag it out. And then make sure that if you take the character out of the game, it's going to affect the plot a lot, right? So if I were to just, let's think of a game. Anybody have a good game with a good storyline they want to bring up? Yes. Hollow Knight? Okay. What character is pivotal to the story?
Main character.
The main character. Fair enough. Fair enough. Are there any side characters? Like, let's say, I haven't played Hollow Knight myself, but I've seen a lot of gameplay of it. Let's say you took out the character that edits the, like the badges. What are those called?
Oh, you can just, the main character you can pick other than that is Hornet. You can just pick Hornet, which is another side character.
Okay. So that wouldn't, okay, never mind. Well, what I'm trying to say is for the guy who does the badges, the badge system, he's not really important to the story, right? So he doesn't need to be important to the story, right? He's just like a mechanic in the world. But from a storyline perspective, I've never made him talk or anything. He doesn't infect the game very much, right? Right. Yeah. So if you ripped him out, it wouldn't be end of the world. You can still enjoy the game experience, still enjoy the world. The only problem with Hollow Knight is that it's very lore heavy. And we're going to talk about lore next. But Hollow Knight is very lore heavy. And you have to understand the lore, right? Or you have to understand the lore just to understand the story. There's not much of a story to the game if you're not looking into the lore. Am I right on that?
Yes and no.
Yes and no? Okay. Again, I haven't played it, so I don't want to speak anymore on that. But just think of the characters, think about how they interact with the story. Make sure that if you were to take them out, the story couldn't really happen. That's a really good way to test to make sure your characters are having a lot of impact on your story. Okay, now we're going to talk about lore. So, for games that are about experiencing a world, it's really great to have lore. Lore can be a pivotal moment of the game or a pivotal feature of the game. A couple games that do that are like Skyrim, Hollow Knight, and a wide variety of other games. But a lot of games have issues where they rely on lore almost too heavily, to the point where if you play through, let's say Dark Souls, for example, it's really hard to glean what the heck is going on without sitting down and like reading logs or watching YouTube videos on people who are explaining the lore of the game and combing through every little detail. And if you want to make an experience like that, where you have to go and like read the comic books in order to understand what the heck is going on in the story, that's fine. That's great. Just know that you're making a very lore-heavy game, and you're picking lore as your main pillar. And that's going to help you out with writing the story of the game as well. Writing lore is also really hard to do because you're not thinking about the main story of the game as much as you're thinking about the entire universe that your game resides in. You're thinking of the past history. You're thinking about the future. You're thinking about what happened to some guy 30 miles away that might affect... That was a Windows sound, wasn't that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a Mac. What was that? Okay. Anyway, yeah, so lore is really hard to write, but it can be really cool, and it can flesh a lot of things out. I recommend lore as not the main pillar, but a side pillar, right? Write a really cool story. Write something that you really want to get your players involved in, and then you can have lore so they can dig even deeper when they're done with the game. So just going off of the bullet points now. What is the history? I already went over that. Consistency is very important for believability, so make sure everything's consistent. Don't write lore about something that like retcons what happened in the actual storyline. Don't say a battle happened when they say that there's been peace for 100 years. Like that should be pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many games that goof that up sometimes. Make sure that when you're writing lore, you're thinking about like the religions that happen in the game, the sciences, different technologies that are involved in the world, geography and climates, arts, magic. And lore can also be, like I said, outside of the game world, right? You can write a book, you can commission a short film, you can have comics, you can have a website, you can have all sorts of cool stuff like that. Just thinking of like off the top of my head, a really popular game that did stuff like that was like, I think Five Nights at Freddy's did something with like web searching. Like you had to go on the website and like deconstruct the code of the website to figure out what the heck was going on within the world. Like you couldn't just play the games and figure it out. You had to go find the website, look through the code of the website. He would have like little hints. You have to take those hints, go on a big scavenger hunt. It was like a whole thing. So that's one way of doing it, right? But you don't have to do that, and I wouldn't recommend making that the main pillar because then people are going to be a little lost and confused. All right, more Kahoot questions. I believe these are the last ones. Yep. Nice. Social media. Is that interactive? Maybe. I mean, when I think of interactivity, I'm thinking like I'm involved in every moment of it, right? I'm not just making a post and then seeing if it gets likes or maybe liking somebody else's post. I'm directly influencing somebody else's creation, right? So in a game world, not only has somebody written something, but I'm now going to affect the outcome of that written story. And notice I didn't say video games, I said games, right? So there are games that are plot-driven that are board games. Has anybody played, what is it, Betrayal on House of the Hill? Has anybody played that game? A couple people, I see a couple, not hand. All right. That game is a story that you act through. It's interactive, and you can kind of influence how that story plays out. And that's just a really great way to interact with the story. With a book, it's written there. Maybe you can have a choose your own adventure style book where you have to flip back and forth on the pages. That's not really interactive. You're still maybe influencing a little bit of the ending, but for the most part, there's still a predetermined ending that you're getting to. And then with movies, I guess like Netflix does stuff now where you can like click, what would happen next. But again, that's actually leaning more towards a video game than anything else. So for the purpose of this question, we're gonna go with games for this answer. All right.
The screen.
Okay, I made that one an easy one. But yeah, you just want to immerse the player. Make sure that they're connected to the story. All right. Last question. I had to get him back.
Choose wisely.
They're all right.
10 people are now my favorite.
Congratulations to our 3 winners. And now we're going to wrap up the rest of the presentation. So, we got the victory music playing in the background. I guess we need that. All right. Interactivity in video games. So this is really hard to do. So always make sure that you're looping your narrative back to a main narrative. Don't keep branching and branching and branching and branching, because that's just gonna be really hard to write for. And you're gonna have so many different endings at some point that you're not gonna be able to make just content for that. Try to make it like the bottom tree, because as you can see, there's tons of different options that the player can influence in the story, but they're always coming back. And then you can see at the end, they still have a bunch of different endings, but those were influenced through what path they took through this tree. And that's going to save you on reusing different assets in your game, right? So you can have people or characters maybe split off into different regions of the game for like one interactive segment that you influenced, but always make them come back to like a main area of the game before moving on to the next section, because if you don't do that, you're going to have to make content for every single potential possibility in the game, maybe every single dialogue option, and that's just way too much work and way too much art. So yeah, reuse as much as possible. Reuse as much music. Maybe you have intense music that happens when you choose a really bad dialogue option. Reuse that for every bad dialogue option. Then you can do something cool where you have a different piece of music if they choose an extra bad dialogue option that will maybe scare the player a lot. And then create the illusion of branching paths. So you're going to be reusing stuff a lot, but try to hide it, right? Easier said than done, I know. But it's really important to maybe branch off in the story, act like a player is doing something different, and then bring them back and try to make them think that they really influenced a different ending. A really good example for this is the Walking Dead series of games, the Telltale Walking Dead series of games. So if any of you have played those before, they would have something where you would choose a dialogue option, and then the character would have a little blurb above them that would say, so-and-so would remember that, right? Like Clementine will remember that you said that. And the player would go, oh, I really messed up, or I shouldn't have said that, or they're going to remember that. It's going to influence them. It didn't do anything. It just popped up and scared the crap out of people. So that's a really good way of doing it, right? So that's a really good way to hide it. So just make sure that you're reusing stuff as much as possible, and you're trying to make it look like you're not doing that. So I'm going to post after the meeting a bunch of different kind of short gameplay clips. And it's going to be about some games that I kind of talked about during this, like Hyper Light Drifter, for example, is going to be in there. And you don't have to check those or anything, but they will be in the meeting chat, and they can be really good examples of different ways to tell stories in games. And I just implore you to kind of sit down and watch through them. So one of them is Hyperlight Drifter. I know another one is the Stanley Parable, if anybody has seen that before. That's a really cool twist on storytelling in games. And there's a few others that I think you guys will get a kick out of. So I recommend you check that out after this meeting. All right, so just a recap of everything we talked about. So use exposition to inform the player, but only use it when it's necessary. Definitely use it if you're going to do a cutscene. Don't waste a cutscene on just random stuff, random nonsense happening. Try to slip some exposition in there to keep pushing the story along. And then use visual storytelling to cut down on the exposition, so that way you don't have to keep retelling a story that the player doesn't need to hear, and you can keep the player moving through a world without having to stop them to make them listen to exposition. Focus on the 3 pillars of game writing. Choose one as your main foundation, and then you can always choose more if you want to. And then keep your branching storyline very simple. Don't branch too much, but make sure that you can always bring it back as well. And with that ends our shorter meeting today. Again, please be right. No, it's not. Basically, again, this is wrong. We're going to have social night this Friday, so bring whatever you want to bring. If you have any questions about what you can or can't bring, feel free to ask us, but it's usually board games, video games. We have a bunch of TVs and screens in that room to play stuff. Anyone's welcome, including people outside of the club, so if you want to bring your friends along and have a good time, you're more than welcome to. Make sure you pay your dues before the game jam. These numbers are wrong. It's 15 for dues, 15 for shirts, and then 25 for dues and shirts. And that's only because we had to up the dues from last year due to some pricing issues. And you don't have to pay your dues again, but if you want to get a prize at the end of the game jam, I highly recommend that. You can always pay that up to the game jam though. Speaking of the game jam, that's coming up pretty soon. It's coming up in about a month. So November, Mitch, do I get the dates right here? Confirm or deny? 11th, 12th, 13th? Or is it 12th, 13th, 14th? I believe it's 11th, 12th, 13th. Okay, so 11th through the 13th is the game jam. We're going to start talking about that more as we get closer. But a game jam is a 48-hour game making competition. Everyone here can come and participate. People outside of the club can come and participate. You have 48 hours to make a game. And if you have any questions about that, come ask me after the meeting. But we will have a meeting on that, about what a game jam is and how to get the most out of a game jam closer to the game jam itself. All right, cool. Go forth, make games, be awesome. Thank you all for coming out.